Covenant. I am Reverend Imran Shuker. Theology of Covenant. Outline. Introduction. Number 1. Covenant as culture. Number 2. Etymology. Number 3. Three major languages. Number 4. The essence and definition of covenant. Number 4.1. Mose Wenfield. Number 4.2. Frank Morey. Number 4.3. Pope Benedict XVI. Number 4.4. Scott Hahn. There are some important questions asked by the faithful. What is the meaning of the establishing a covenant? What are the four major covenant and reformed? What is the meaning of seventh heaven? English translation of terms for covenant. The meaning of the establishing a covenant: self-curse, secular covenant, cutting animals, common meal, the use of family terms, categories of covenant, kinship-type, seventh heaven. Seven is Sabbath, the task of Adam and Eve, till and God, winding family circles and covenant. Four major covenant and reform: household Noah, tribal Abraham, nation Moses, worldwide kingdom David. Economic shortfall: divine covenants in the Bible, the goal of creation and soul of worship. Conclusion. Covenant. I am Reverend Imran Shuker. Theology of Covenant. Outline. Introduction. Number 1. Covenant as culture. Number 2. Etymology. Number 3. Three major languages. Number 4. The essence and definition of covenant. Number 4.1. Mose Wenfield. Number 4.2. Frank Morey. Number 4.3, Pope Benedict XVI. Number 4.4, Scott Hahn. There are some important questions asked by the faithful. What is the meaning of the establishing a covenant? What are the four major covenant and reformed? What is the meaning of seventh heaven? English translation of terms for covenant. The meaning of the establishing a covenant: self-curse, secular covenant, cutting animals, common meal, the use of family terms, categories of covenant, kinship-type, seventh heaven. Seven is Sabbath, the task of Adam and Eve, till and God, winding family circles and covenant. Four major covenant and reform: household Noah, tribal Abraham, nation Moses, worldwide kingdom David. Economic shortfall: divine covenants in the Bible, the goal of creation and soul of worship. Conclusion. Introduction. The relationship of Yahweh and Israel is unique in the religions of the ancient world. In other ancient religions, the deity is identified either with nature or with the society that worships the deity. In the biblical covenant, God is always the Lord and individuals or the people are the inferior party. To Noah, God promises never to destroy humankind again by a flood. The book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 8 till 17. To Abraham, God promises many descendants and the land of Canaan. The book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 15. The gift of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai is narrated in the book of the covenant, in the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 24. Covenant language is also prominent in text referring to the relationship between God and David's descendants. The 2 Samuel chapter 77. Whereas the covenant with Abraham and David are promises without conditions, the Sinai covenant and the book of Deuteronomy give many stipulations binding upon Israel if the covenant relationship is to be continued. Covenant as culture. A kinship bound between two parties, with conditions or obligations established by an oath or its equivalent. Covenants were ubiquitous in the ancient Near East as well as Greco-Roman culture as a means to forge and maintain a relationship between individuals, family, tribe, and even nations. Covenant is also the master theme of the Bible, which records the various ways throughout the history that God has drawn humanity into a familiar relationship with Himself through divine oaths. Etymology: covenant, an agreement between two or more persons to do or refrain from doing some act or compact or contract in biblical use, the agreement or engagement of God with man as set forth in the Old and New Testament. To agree to by covenant, stipulate to enter into a covenant. Three major languages: Hebrew, Berit, Greek, diatheke, Latin, testamentum. In the Latin tradition has obscured the fact that the Bible is divided into scriptures based on two covenants, the Old and New Testament. Nevertheless, distinction points to the undefinable contrariety of the concept of covenant to biblical thought and Christian theology. This demonstrates the importance of covenant to the plan of salvation. The essence and definition of covenant. Covenant is a major term for the relationship between God and God's people. Hebrew and Greek words are used to refer to agreement or alliance between people, leaders, and subjects and individuals. The secular background has been greatly illuminated by the discovery of treaty documents from the ancient Near East. A covenant between equals is called a party treaty, whereas a covenant between a lord and a servant is a suzerainty, or the suzerainty treaties contain some recurrent elements. Moshe Pinfield said that the covenant is in its essence a legal means to establish kinship between two previous unrelated parties. Frank Morey explained that a covenant is a widespread legal means by which the duties and privileges of kinship may be intended to another individual or group, including aliens. This kinship or familial relationship was regulated by conditions or obligations specified during the covenant making ceremony, usually consisting of the liturgical rite culminating in a verbal or ritual oath performed by one or both of the parties to the covenant. Pope Benedict XVI. In the biblical conception, a covenant is not a contract or the mutual agreement between God and man, but an unsought gift of God to man. The covenant then is not a pact built on reciprocity, but rather a gift, a creative act of God's love. In their concrete historical realizations, the covenants of God take multiple forms. Scott Hahn. According to Scott Hahn, he said that covenant creates family bonds that are even stronger than biological bonds. That's something that every ancient Hebrew knew. So when they heard the news that God was making a covenant with them, they knew that He was no longer merely a lawgiver or judge. He was a father for most and forever. English translation of terms for covenant. The word employed for covenant in the Old Testament is Hebrew berit. The ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, consistently rendered this term with the Greek word diatheke. There can be little doubt that the New Testament authors followed the practice of the Septuagint and employed the term diatheke to mean berit, covenant. English translation of terms for covenant. But because classical Greek authors used diatheke to refer to a testament, some older English translations, such as the King James Version, render diatheke as testament in certain passages. The means of establishing a covenant. The Bible and various ancient Near East texts describe a variety of ways that were used to establish or solemnize a covenant between two parties. In almost every case, the central act of covenant making was the swearing of an oath by one or both of the parties of the covenant. Self-curse. The oath generally took the form of self-curse. The covenant maker called on God or the gods to inflict death or some other grave calamity upon himself should he fail to keep the obligation of the covenant he was entering. This oath could be verbally pronounced or it could be expressed by a ritual. Secular covenant. Secular covenant texts from the ancient Near East record a wide variety of ritual self-curse, such as this one described in an Assyrian text from 754 BC. This head is not the head of lamb, it is the head of Mate-ilu, the covenant maker. If Mate-ilu sin against this covenant, so may, just as the head of this spring lamb is torn off, the head of Mate-ilu be turned off. We can see some passages from the Bible, from the book of Genesis chapter 21, verse 31 till 32, then chapter 22, verse 16, then chapter 26, verse 28, the book of Joshua, chapter 9, verse 15, the book of prophet Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 59, then chapter 17, verse 13 till 19. Cutting animals. Similar ritual self-curse was performed by cutting animals in two or passing between the carcasses. The book of Genesis chapter 15, then the book of prophet Jeremiah chapter 34 verse 18. This ritually represented the intention, may I be slain like these animals if I do not maintain this covenant. The Bible records other ritual self-curses as well. The sacrifice of animals and sprinkling of blood. The book of Exodus chapter 24 verse 8. The book of Psalm 50 verse 5, expressing, may my blood be shed like the blood of these animals, and circumcision. The book of Genesis chapter 17 verse 10, expressing, may I myself be cut off if I do not keep the covenant. Common meal. Other rituals associated with covenant solemnization in Scripture do not express a self-curse but exemplify other aspects of the covenant relationship. Often the covenant-making parties share a common meal to confirm their new familiar relationship. The book of Genesis chapter 26 verse 30, then chapter 31 verse 54. The book of Exodus chapter 24 verse 11, then the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 22 verse 14 till 23. The use of family terms. Brother. The first King chapter 20 verse 32 till 34. Father and son. The book of Psalms, Psalm 89 verse 26 till 28. Then 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 14. The exchange of clothing or other gifts could also express familial intimacy. The first book of Samuel chapter 18 verse 3, then the book of Genesis chapter 21 verse 27. Most of the rituals used in covenant making or covenant renewal were essentially liturgical in nature. They were performed according to sacred customs in the presence of God or the gods, who was called on to witness to and enforce the covenant obligations. Since the divine presence was important to the liturgical rites of the covenant making, sacred locations such as temples or holy mountains were preferred places for covenant rituals. Categories of covenant. Covenant may be placed into two categories according to the status of the covenant-making parties. Human covenant are between two human parties, whereas divine covenants includes God as one partner. Kinship-type. When both parties swear the covenant oath, a kinship or party covenant is formed. This covenant type is labelable kinship because the familiar nature of the covenant bound is at the forefront of the relationship, rather than the subordination of one of the parties to the other. The mutual swearing of the oath indicates that both parties accept responsibility for keeping the covenant, obligations resulting in an equal, or at least reciprocal, relationship between the two. Several kinship-type covenants in Scripture included a family meal in the covenant-making ritual. The book of Genesis, chapter 26, verse 30, then chapter 31, verse 54. The book of Exodus, chapter 24, verse 11. Vessel type. When the inferior party alone swear the oath, a vessel type covenant results. In this situation, the superior party imposes a covenant relationship on the inferior, who is often a rebellious servant. Ancient Near Eastern examples of vassal covenant include the well-known vassal treaties of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, in 681 till 669 BC, which Esarhaddon imposed on untrustworthy vassal kings to ensure their obedience to his heir, Ashrah bin Paul. Biblical examples include the covenant of circumcision in the book of Genesis chapter 17, where only Abraham performed the covenant oath ritual, and the covenant of Deuteronomy, in which only the people of Israel invoke the self-curse to fulfill the terms of covenant. The book of Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 11 till 26. Then the book of Joshua chapter 8, verse 30 to 35. Grand type. When the superior party alone swears the oath, he establishes a grand type covenant with the inferior party. These grand covenants were frequently employed by ancient Near Eastern kings to reward faithful servants, often by granting them a piece of royal land, hence the term grant in perpetuity. In this covenant form, the superior party assumed all responsibility for the maintenance of the covenant. In view of some prior meritorious action by the inferior, biblical examples include the final form of the Abrahamic covenant, the book of Genesis chapter 22, verse 15 till 18, and Davidic covenant, especially as described in Psalms 89, verse 3 to 37. Seventh heaven. According to Scott Hahn, the Bible begins with the story of creation. God made Adam not as yet another one of the animals, but in the divine image and likeness. These terms speak volumes about man's original status in God's sight. Same words appears next in Genesis chapter 5 verse 3. When the Bible tells us that Adam fathers a son named Seth in his own likeness after his image. 7 is Sabbath. By explaining the theology of Sabbath, Scott Hahn explained that how God made covenant with man to participate in divine life. God made him on the sixth day, but for the sake of the seventh day, it is the seventh day, the Sabbath, that God blessed and hallowed and declared a day of rest. The book of Genesis chapter 2 verse 2 till 3. Now why would God do this? He is almighty, so he does not grow tired. He had no need of Sabbath zone. What purpose then could the Sabbath serve? Let's look more closely. The Sabbath is a seventh day, and the Hebrew word for seven is Shiva. Yet Shiva stands not only for a number, Shiva is also a verb, and it means to swear a covenant oath. Literally, to seven oneself. We can see more examples. Abraham's covenant oath in the book of Genesis, chapter 21, verse 27 till 32. The number 7 is an unmistakable sign of covenant. The Sabbath then stood as a sign of God's covenant with creation. The book of Exodus, chapter 31, verse 16 till 17. The theology of Sabbath symbolizes man's God's given destiny to rest in God's blessing and holiness for all eternity. The Sabbath was made for man, Jesus said. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, verse 27. The task of Adam. In the Genesis account, Adam receives many of the tasks that ancient readers would recognize as a belonging to a family's firstborn son. God commanded Adam till in Hebrew Abudah and to God in Hebrew Shamar, the garden where he would live, in the book of Genesis chapter 2 verse 15. In doing so, God placed Adam not only as a landowner and laborer but also as a priest. For those words, Abudah and Shamar, appear together elsewhere in the Pentateuch only in preference to the Levites' priestly service in Israel. The book of Numbers, chapter 3, verse 7 till 8, then chapter 8, verse 26, then chapter 18, verse 5 till 6. Till and guard. These were the terms of the covenant. Then be fruitful and multiply. The book of Genesis chapter 1 verse 28. Second, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat, for it you shall die. The book of Genesis chapter 2 verse 16 till 17. Yet Adam violated the covenant. He sinned. He ate the fruit of the forbidden tree, and he brought death and suffering upon himself and all his offspring. Worst of all, in breaking the covenant, he separated himself and all his offspring from God's family. This is also written in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph number 403 and 404, regarding the sin of Adam, bound by covenant to live forever as a son of God. Adam chose instead to live outside the family as a slave. Four major covenant and form. In the Old Testament, we read of God renewing his covenant on four more occasions: to Noah, to Abraham, to Moses, and to David. With each succeeding covenant, God opened membership in his covenant family to ever more people, first to a married couple, then to a household, then to a tribe, then to a nation, then a kingdom. First is God's covenant with Adam and Eve. God created Adam and Eve to be joined together as one flesh. The book of Genesis chapter 2 verse 23 till 4. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He shall be called a woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man leave his father and his mother, and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." Household. Noah. When God preserved the family of Noah, he swore never again to destroy the earth by flood. The book of Genesis chapter 9 verse 8 till 17. The sign of covenant with Noah was the rainbow. Tribal. Abraham. When God led Abraham to the promised land, he pledged that Abraham's tribe would increase and bring blessing to all the earth. The book of Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 till 3, then chapter 22 verse 16 till 18. The sign of the covenant with Abraham was circumcision. Nation. Moses. When God worked through Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt and into Canaan, he promised to make the Israelites a holy nation of priests, restoring the inheritance of Abraham and the rights and duties of Adam. The book of Exodus chapter 19 verse 5 till 6. The sign of covenant with Moses was the Passover. Worldwide kingdom. David. Then to David, God promised to build a worldwide kingdom and restore all people to proper worship. The second book of Samuel, chapter 7, verse 8 till 19. The sign of this covenant was the dynastic throne of House of David. Fall of covenant. Every covenant requires a sacrifice symbolic of man's total self-giving. For a covenant is not a contract, it is not an exchange of goods. A covenant is an exchange of persons. One person gives up his former self, his former identity, to be accepted into a new family. Yet every covenant in the Old Testament foundered because of individuals' refusal to give their all. Fall of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree. The book of Genesis chapter 3. Fall of Noah. Noah built an ark, but then he got drunk. The book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 21. Fall of Abraham. Abraham acted faithfully in uprooting himself and emigrating for an heir, and so he took a concubine, a mistress. The book of Genesis, chapter 16, verse 1 till 4. Fall of Moses. Moses trusted the Lord, and yet he struck the rock in anger and given in to his temper. The book of Numbers, chapter 20, verse 11. Fall of David. David was a man after God's own heart, yet he committed adultery with Bathsheba. The second book of Samuel, chapter 11, verse 1 till 5. All of these men display both tremendous virtue and fatal vice. In each of these chosen men, we find partial fulfillment. Each of them faced an incredible challenges task and performed it with faithfulness, and yet failed at a decisive point, showing us that some greater intermediary would have to establish some greater covenant. For nothing less than total self-giving would do. Nothing else could serve to imitate the Trinitarian life. Goal of creation and the soul of worship. Benedict reads God's covenant, will and desire beginning on the very first pages of Scripture in the account of creation. He does so through an exegesis that sees parallels in the canonical text between the creation of heaven and earth and Moses' building of the tabernacle. In both the Genesis and Exodus accounts, a place is being made for God to dwell with his covenant people. There is also a centrality in each account of a rhythm involving the cosmically significant number 7 and the law of the seventh day, the Sabbath, which is a law of worship. Conclusion. Covenant is a bond that holds a family together. In our situation, we humans always disobey the covenant of God. He is our creator and superior, making a covenant relationship with us so that we may have through his word, because we are a rebellious servant who always goes in our own ways. Each of the Old Testament covenant failed in its own turn. Every time God sought to restore humanity family bound with the Creator, humans choose again to sin and break the bond. God remained constantly faithful. Adam did not, and neither did Noah, neither did Moses, neither did David. In fact, sacred history leads us to conclude that only God keeps his covenant promises. How then could humans fulfill their end of the covenant in a way that would last forever? That would require a person to be as sinless and as constant as God himself. These are the bibliography which I have taken all this knowledge in order to explain about covenant. Thanks for watching. Have an eternal home. God bless you all.